The delegates were acutely aware that what they were going to produce would have flaws. George Mason of Virginia said the most important provision in the Constitution will be the one that will allow us to amend it in the future and correct our mistakes. And on the final day of the convention, Ben Franklin made an appeal for everyone to sign the convention, as did Alexander Hamilton, signed the Constitution, just saying, of course, there's provisions in here you don't like. There are provisions in here we don't like. But we have to recognize that this is the best we can do, and this is the best we're going to get. That notion, and they've just come through 4 months of hard political bargaining, striking compromises that many of them despise. Madison really doesn't like a lot of the provisions of the Constitution. Hamilton doesn't like most of the Constitution. But they think the country needs a new charter, and they'll do the best they can with it. And that was the attitude with which 36 out of 39 of them signed.
The Constitution's amendment provision is Article 5. And Article 5 sets out a procedure that has essentially 2 parts. And the first part is that somebody has to propose a constitutional amendment, and then the second part is somebody has to approve it. Each of those 2 parts can be accomplished in 2 ways. The typical way is that Congress, by 2/3 majority of both houses, both the House and the Senate, makes a proposal and then sends it out to the states, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. And that's been done 27 times. The first 10 amendments and then 17 amendments since then. But there are other methods. Congress can also authorize a constitutional convention upon the petition of 2/3 of the states. Regardless of how, though, you propose them, whether through a convention or through Congress, there's the ratification. I've mentioned one of those 2 ratification methods. That's by 3/4 of the state legislatures, but you can also have 3/4 of the states call their own little mini conventions, and they can use those conventions to ratify as well. Interesting 2-part process. Each of those 2 parts has 2 different variations.
The founders didn't want it to be easy to change the Constitution because they didn't want the whims and passions of the public to sit in judgment. They wanted the reason of the public to sit in judgment.
The process of amending the Constitution has not been implemented too often because it's relatively difficult, more difficult now than when that process was created. Most of the amendments deal with either the functions of government or they deal with individual rights. You have the amendments after the Civil War that freed the slaves and gave former slaves the right to vote. You've got the amendment that deals with women's suffrage. And then you have amendments that deal with such things as how long a president can serve, limiting the term to 2 terms. And then you got this interesting amendment that was prohibition and was later repealed. And I tell people that should tell you that the lessons of prohibition are very sobering. And the amendment process should be used carefully and wisely and not for merely disputes over public policy.
I like to think of our constitutional history as a repeated process of setting very, very high aspirations and then struggling, often for decades or centuries, to live up to those aspirations. Perhaps one of the most fundamental, implicit goals of our Constitution is the concept of equality. Interesting that word doesn't appear in our original Constitution, but it did appear in the Declaration of Independence, and it was implicit in the concept of a republican government with wide suffrage. But at the time we adopted our Constitution, only a tiny percentage of our people could actually vote. It was basically guys like me. It was old white guys who had property who could actually vote. That leaves a lot of people out of the process. It leaves women out of the process. It leaves slaves out of the process. It left Native Americans out of the process. And so over the course of 2 centuries, including one massive civil war, we eventually said, no, black people can vote, or at least black men can vote in the 15th Amendment. Yes, 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 15th Amendment said black men can vote. 19th Amendment said, finally, women can vote. And the 26th Amendment said that people 18 and over can vote. 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes. That was a gradual expansion over the course of more than a century, almost 2 centuries, of expanding the franchise and expanding the idea of equality. And I think that you can look at a lot of examples in our constitutional history, from religious freedom to other forms of liberty. We set high aspirations, and then we struggle to live up to them.
The amendment process to the Constitution makes it possible for a constitutional convention to be convened, similar to 1787. And there are people who want to do that, and for good reason. I mean, this government, in many ways, does not resemble a lot of what the Constitution talks about. Having said that, and I don't put the framers of the Constitution on a pedestal. They are people. They are human beings with all the good and all the liabilities that come with all of us. But I would be wary of a national constitutional convention in the modern age. Not because we don't have good men and women and thoughtful men and women and problems we have to tackle, but we also have multitasking and social networking and sound bites and 24/7 conversations, and the ability to have the kind of conversations that took place in Philadelphia, candid conversations behind closed doors, where tough issues had to be hammered out. That is very difficult in the modern age. That explains a lot of the challenges Congress has. They can't separate themselves from the people so they can serve the people. So our ability to do that in the modern age seems to me very questionable. And so I guess, for me anyway, I'd be wary of a constitutional convention.
Americans, I think quite rightly, have been afraid of conventions. You can just burn down the house and start over on a blank piece of paper, and that would be disruptive and hard to get right. We learned that we can make big mistakes with the Constitution. You know, we adopted a way of choosing the president that didn't work very well. We installed slavery when we didn't mean to. We left out a Bill of Rights that we should have included. It's easy to screw up, and I think that awareness has kept us away from subsequent conventions.